be discussing my empirical evaluation of hair's tensile strength after dyeing with various colors. To introduce myself, my name is Kathryn Jones, and I'm currently a senior at Andover High School. I plan to take a gap year and then pursue a degree in clinical psychology. I have a personal connection with this topic because I've been my own hairstylist since 6th grade. This has included many dyeing experiences, as you can see on the top right. Unfortunately, this also led me to learn the hard way that it's easy to misjudge your hair's resilience to damage. You can see on the bottom left my hair after attempting to remove red hair dye. It's clearly still very red and very damaged. No other color had done this to my hair, which led me to question whether different colors of hair dye could cause different levels of damage. I think this is an important question to address because allowing consumers to know product tendencies will also allow them to avoid the risk of surprise damage. This is especially useful for people that have dyed their hair before and are consequentially more likely to experience damage. Before beginning my experiment, I studied the existing work in the field. Through this, I learned that the cuticle is the outer protective layer of the hair strand. It's the most vulnerable to chemical and mechanical damage, and it consists of 4 layers of keratinized cells that are arranged like shingles on a roof. The cortex is the middle layer of the hair strand and makes up 75% of the hair's matrix. This layer is mostly made of disulfide bonds and also contains the melanin molecules that provide pigment to the hair. The medulla is the innermost layer of the hair strand. There is very little known about this layer, which makes it a gap in the field. All hair is unique, but because the hair in my experiment was European American, we'll focus on the general qualities that are associated with that hair type. The shape of the hair strand is what determines the hair's texture. As you can see in the top image, the more circular the hair strand, the straighter the hair will be. The bottom image shows the cross-sectional view of a curly hair strand, which is going to be more oval. The cross-sectional size is also what determines the hair's tensile strength. The uniform cuticle layers of European American hair also contribute to its unique tensile strength. However, despite that uniformity, the cuticle scales lift easily when exposed to chemical treatments, making it one of the more vulnerable hair types. Moving on from the hair's structure, it's also important to understand what the dye is doing to produce the pigment. Permanent hair dye utilizes an oxidation reaction, which creates colored molecules within the hair strand, specifically within the cortex. Oxidative dyes are also a 2-part system. The precursor and coupler are found in the color gel, while the developer contains the oxidizers, which are typically ammonia and hydrogen peroxide. Ammonia is the most common oxidizer used to force the cuticle scales to swell and lift, allowing the other dye molecules to enter the cortex and begin reacting. Once in the cortex, the hydrogen peroxide portion of the mixture will lighten the existing color of the hair while also reacting with the precursors to form intermediates. This is pictured in the top image. The middle image shows the coupler reacting with the intermediate and the oxidizer to chemically bond the two. The resulting molecule will have a much higher molar mass and will also be much larger in size, meaning they can no longer exit the cortex. That's what makes this dye permanent in comparison to other types. Keeping in mind what I've said about the hair structure and how hair dye works, let's discuss some general damage that can occur from dyeing. The top image illustrates a healthy virgin hair strand. The cuticle scales are flat and there is normal layer distribution underneath. As previously stated, coloring treatments cause the cuticle scales to swell and lift. The middle image shows how damaged and poorly arranged they become once they've laid themselves back down. At this point, they're liable to break off, leaving the superficial cortex exposed. The bottom image is an extreme example of this, where the cuticle has been completely ripped off. Additionally, split ends will likely occur on the final centimeters of the hair strand, and when combined with additional grooming damage, it's possible that they can break off or fibrillate. The oxidative conditions of permanent hair dye are caused by the high pH of the oxidants. The penetration of these highly alkaline solutions between the cuticle layers causes cysteine in the CMC, or cellular membrane complex, to be converted to cysteic acid. Cysteine acts as the glue that holds the cuticle scales together. So it's possible that by decreasing the bonding and support from its elimination, that's a specific cause of the cuticle scaling and deterioration. As my literature review reflected, the current field focuses on the structure of hair, the chemical composition of dye, or the general damage that can be seen after dyeing. However, there is very little research providing direct links from the chemicals to the consequential hair damage. Therefore, my research question investigates how the color of hair dye affects the level of damage that it causes. My null hypothesis states that if my hair samples are dyed various colors, then there would be no difference in damage among the groups. My research hypothesis states that if my hair samples are dyed various colors, then one color would be the most damaging. I crafted this hypothesis around my personal experience with dye, where red seemed to be the most damaging. The independent variable in my study was the color of hair dye used. The dependent variable was the amount of damage caused by the dye, and the control group consisted of untreated hair samples. The constants in my study largely overlap with my sample population because the hair was taken from one male donor with virgin hair. To begin my experiment, I gathered my materials. This most notably included the 28 hair samples, hot glue, cloth, aluminum foil, and the 3 Wella dyes in the shades red terracotta, black noir, and light brown. I used hot glue to secure the hair samples to a piece of fabric so that it wouldn't wash away during the dyeing and rinsing process. I then numbered the hair samples 1 through 28 and used a random number generator to assign them to a color group. Once the color groups had been finalized, I followed the manufacturer's instructions and mixed a 1-part color gel to 2-part developer mixture. I used a 10-volume developer because it oxidizes the least amount of pigment from the hair. Because the focus of my study was on color-specific damage from the dye, I wanted to reduce the likelihood of damage from the developer itself. On day 1, the respective hair dye was applied to each color group, covered with aluminum foil, and left to process for 30 minutes. Following the 30 minutes, the hair was rinsed and left to air dry. On day 2, the same process was repeated. The tensile strength of the hair was used as the basis for damage comparison. Roughly 15 hairs were cut loose from the fabric binder and formed into a loop shape that the hook weights could attach to. I added weights starting from 5 grams until the hair broke. Tensile strength by definition is the maximum load a material can withstand before breaking. Therefore, the last supported weight was determined to be the tensile strength. The same tensile testing process was repeated for the remaining color groups. I then observed the hair strands under a microscope in order to visualize some of the damage. To finalize my experiment, I compiled my raw data and conducted a statistical analysis. I used an ANOVA test to analyze my data in the Data Classroom software to create this graph. The dye group's data is clearly much more spread out than the control group. Therefore, it was hard to establish the mean or average damage for the dye groups because every hair sample basically had a different ending tensile strength. The red dye group had the highest variance between each hair sample's tensile strength. This caused the red dye group to have the highest standard deviation and highest standard error of the mean. Despite the widespread data, it had the lowest mean, meaning that it was the most damaged group with the lowest average tensile strength. The black and brown color groups experienced almost the same amount of damage, leaving them with very similar means because of their very similar tensile strength. Consequently, there was no significant relationship between those two dyes because they caused roughly the same amount of damage. All of the data groups have at least one distant outlier. This, combined with the high standard deviation, suggests a large variance between the baseline tensile strength of the hair samples. Aside from quantifying my data, I also observed the effects under a microscope. Please keep in mind this is one hair strand and it is not representative of the entire group. As you can see, this red hair strand's cuticles has jagged edges and there is mild cuticle lifting. The black hair strand's cuticles are clearly raised, distorted, as well as broken. I'm not sure why the brown hair strand is so colorful. Nonetheless, the cuticle scales are visibly lifted and the end of the hair strand is fibrillated. The virgin hair strand's cuticle scales have rounded edges and are not lifted or distorted. I used an ANOVA test for my data because I was aiming to compare the tensile strengths of each group in order to determine if there was a difference in damage according to the dye color used. The data showed that the red hair dye group had the highest mean damage because it had the lowest average tensile strength. Therefore, at the significance level of 0.05, I was able to support my research hypothesis with a p-value of less than 0.01. My research hypothesis stated that if my hair samples are dyed various colors, then one color will cause the most damage. Despite the rejection of my null hypothesis with a strong p-value, there was a significant standard deviation and standard error of the mean. The high variance decreases the stability of my results. Unfortunately, I did not encounter any studies that could provide clarity to my findings or support them in any way. I believe that the high variance could have been due to the small sample size since there were only 7 hair bundles in each group. Additionally, a 2009 study suggested that taking hair strictly from the occipital region of the scalp would have been most beneficial since that hair is the least damaged. Unfortunately, my participant did not have enough hair to do this. The current study's results raise other important questions. Red dye, which was most similar to a fantasy color, caused the most damage. Future studies could investigate whether or not fantasy colors are more damaging than natural colors. The field could also be greatly expanded if scientists could conclude which couplers are the most damaging. Couplers are the main color-causing chemicals, so if they could establish which couplers are most damaging, they would also be able to establish which colors of dye cause the most damage. My biggest takeaway from this process was the importance of commitment. It's been a very lengthy assignment and a very new concept, but being committed to doing my best on every part allowed everything to go smoothly. Of course, I would never have been able to do this without the help of Ms. Long and her infinite resources and guidance. I would also like to thank Ms. Dillon for offering her expertise on microscope handling, Ms. Fain for allowing me to use her hook weights, my participant for shaving his head in the name of science, and my dad for letting me hog the laundry room for the entirety of this experiment. I would also like to thank you all for your time. Are there any questions? Yes.
So I know you were just trying to determine the differences between different colors of dye and which one was the most damaging, but I noticed that in your experience, for your own dyeing experience, that you had repeated dye on your own hair. And so do you think that that's another implication that you might look into, is like a single person's hair, how damaged it becomes the more times it's dyed?
Ms. Wall is asking whether one person's hair becomes more damaged after dyeing, how it can become more damaged after dyeing. And I definitely think this is a good area of research, because typically people do dye their hair more than one time to maintain the color or switch it up, and it would definitely be very beneficial.
Do you think, so you have male hair, do you think maybe the color of hair may create a different results, blonde hair versus dark hair?
Dr. Jones is asking whether or not the color of the participant's hair could have been a factor in the results of my experiment. Because I didn't go any lighter than his hair and therefore bleach was not involved, I don't think that would have been a factor.
How about, so continued use, do you think continued use can permanently impact someone's hair, or do you think that because hair continues to grow, once you cut and done away with the dye, then your hair can go back to its natural vibe or texture?
Dr. Jones is asking whether or not the hair can go back to its original state. This would be true for the hair growing, but the hair that has already been dyed cannot get much better than it is. One of my studies showed that after 8 weeks, it could show some improvement, but again, it would remain pretty damaged.